Thank you, Lynn. So we're going to go into a conversation about morality, markets, and capitalism. And with us, we will have a leader of the religious community in the Honorable, the Archbishop Justin Welby, and one of the foremost advocates for free markets and capitalism, and that is Arthur Brooks, the president of the American Enterprise Institute. So we'll hear first from you, Arthur, and the Archbishop and I will come up and have a conversation. Over to you, Arthur.
Thank you, Darren. What an honor to be with you, Your Eminence, Your Grace, Lady Lynn. It's wonderful to be with you, and thank you so much for inviting me. Darren just told you that I'm the president of the American Enterprise Institute, a free market-oriented think tank in Washington, D.C. My path to this spot is winding and non-traditional. I was a French horn player for 12 years before I was in the Barcelona Symphony specifically. And when I was a French horn player all the way through my 20s, my favorite composer was Johann Sebastian Bach. Everyone in here knows Bach's work. Bach was a great visionary. He was the highest exemplar of the High Baroque. Bach seemed endlessly productive. He published more than 1,000 great works. Cantatas fell off his pen. He was a wonder of the great Baroque. Bach also, by the way, had 20 children, which is very productive, I might say. Bach was asked near the end of his life by a minor biographer, and this was saved for posterity, thank God, Herr Bach, why do you write music? It's an extraordinary question. Why? How many times have you been asked, why do you do what you do? Not how do you do it or what do you do, but why do you do it? What is your purpose? Here was Bach's answer. The aim and final end of all music is nothing less than the glorification of God and the enjoyment of man. That had a profound impact on me when I was making my living in the Barcelona Orchestra. I asked myself, is the aim and final end of my work nothing less than the glory of God and the good of my fellow man? And I made a career shift on the basis of this question. Believe it or not, I became an economist. Why? Because what I care about the most in life is poverty. I grew up in a lower middle class home in a working class neighborhood in Seattle, and there was a lot of American poverty growing up. Most of the people around us were single parent families. A lot of people were on welfare. But I remember the first time I saw true poverty when I was 6 or 7 years old in the early 1970s. It was the same place that a lot of you saw true poverty with your own eyes, which was not in person. It was a picture in the National Geographic magazine. And I remember it clearly. My brother had a subscription. And as I was looking through, I remember seeing a picture of a boy my own age, more or less, in sub-Saharan Africa, with flies on his face and a distended belly. You remember this picture. Some of you saw it too, or one like it. And I remember the sensation of impotence, of unfairness, that this boy, through no fault of his own, would somehow be starving. There was nothing I could do. Alms for the poor, my allowance in the basket on Sunday morning. But that wasn't going to do it. The clear implication was that this boy was going to perish, and there's nothing that could be done. Well, I grew up and went to school and started a career and started my family, and occasionally I wondered what happened to that boy. Not him specifically, what happened to people who were that poor. And I found out. And that's why I became an advocate of free enterprise. See, here's what has happened to the world's poorest people since I was a child. Now, to be sure, there is too much poverty in the world, and I believe we are morally commanded to fight it every single day. But the poverty from the year 1970 until today, the percentage of the world's population living on $1 a day or less, that percentage has decreased since 1970 by 80%. An 80% decrease in the world's worst poverty since I was a child. It's a miracle. No anti-poverty achievement in the history of humanity has ever done anything like this. We have pulled 2 billion people out of starvation level poverty, and it's treated like a state secret Nobody appears to know this. 70% of Americans think that hunger is worse than in the early 1970s. They're wrong. It's 80% better. So you have to ask yourself, why? What did this incredible miracle? Now, you may or may not be an advocate for the United Nations or foreign aid. I believe these are good institutions and they're important, but these are not the reason that 80% of the world's poorest people have been pulled out of starvation. No. There are 5 reasons for this: globalization, free trade, property rights, the rule of law, entrepreneurship. You see, in 1970, we saw the poor, and they saw you. The explosion of mass communications after 1970 made it possible for people to see how you lived in the West. They saw development, they saw freedom. Many, billions, threw off the chains of their poverty and the chains of tyranny so they could be more like you. This is a great moral achievement. You are responsible for it because you are the stewards of the free enterprise system, and that's the reason that I got into this business, was because I want the next 2 billion people. But we have a problem. We have a problem today. The force of progress in the world has become dangerously uneven. You've heard some of the proof of that here today. Consider my own country, the United States, in the wake of the financial crisis in 2008. Economists like me will tell you that we will see in the United States a 2.5% economic growth rate this year. That's a lie. Here's what we'll see. In the top 20% of the income distribution, we'll see a 6% economic growth rate. And in the bottom half of the economy, we'll see a 0% economic growth rate. That is dangerously uneven and unsustainable. Since January of 2009, the American stock market has grown in inflation-adjusted terms by about 130%. 81% of those gains have gone into the top 10% of the income distribution. Meanwhile, 1 in 6 Americans, 48 million Americans are on food assistance. That has gone, by the way, since January of 2009, up by 50% over the course of the recovery. 32 million Americans to 48 million Americans, so poor that they're required to rely on their own government to feed themselves and their families. So what's happened? Some will tell you that capitalism has run its course, that it's become a net force for creating winners and losers and not lifting up the masses. I reject this patently, and I believe all of you reject this as well. The challenge of our time is not to make capitalism less pervasive. The challenge is to make capitalism more inclusive, to share it with everybody so that we can recreate the miracles of the last 4 decades. Here are the policy questions of our time that I submit to you with appropriate humility. How can we push free enterprise down more? And I ask this. This is my own professional and personal examination of conscience before I go to sleep each night. I run a think tank in Washington, D.C., at the center of political power in Washington. I work with the leaders of both parties. I'm privileged to work with candidates for President of the United States. I talk about the economy and foreign policy, and especially about capitalism and free enterprise every day. But here's my examination of conscience before I go to sleep. Not, was the press nice to me today? Of course they weren't. The question is, did all of my work go for the benefit of people with less power than me? That, I believe, is the examination of conscience of modern capitalism. If the answer is no, I've made a mistake. If the answer is yes, then it's time to get a good night's sleep and come back and fight harder tomorrow. The world needs us. Capitalism is a force for good, but only if we share it enough. God bless your work. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very provocative, and you are articulating this new paradigm of capitalism that is pro-poor, which I think is, in some people's minds, irreconcilable, but we'll get to that. But first, for the Archbishop Justin, we're here today to talk about this idea of inclusive capitalism. But do you think inclusive capitalism is enough as we've talked about it conceptually?
No. But I think Arthur's just nicked all my best lines. So I'm to some extent drawing on what he said, and obviously what Pope Francis said earlier, and even the Lord Mayor. Though just, sorry, Lord Mayor, my Lord Mayor, I need to get a dig in there. Actually, my predecessor negotiated Magna Carta. You lot just signed it. So I just thought I'd get that one in quickly. I think Arthur set out the challenge very, very clearly. And I think it comes down to saying inclusive of what? What worries me about just talking about inclusive capitalism is that our ambition is not sufficiently vaulting, sufficiently broad-ranging, sufficiently great to say that the great issues of the world to which Prince Charles referred, to which the Pope referred, can be changed. Inclusive capitalism has to face two enormous challenges, and Arthur has referred to them. One is the environment and what happens in the environment, sustainability of our world, and the second is the global descent into fractured communities that are fighting and struggling with each other with extreme violence, not on a global war as we've had before, but at local areas, which undermine the stability of our global community. If you'd gone back to the 1970s and said, can inclusive capitalism get rid of 80% of the problems of people on less than $1 a day, the answer, all of us would have thought it was absurd. I want to say, can capitalism be sufficiently inclusive to draw in those whose value systems are deeply challenged by it and see it, incidentally, historically, as a Christian imposition arising out of the imperialist era? Can it be sufficiently inclusive to overcome that and challenge the moves towards violence and rejection and isolation in our world? Can we actually transform the planet in which we live?
And because capitalism has at its roots this idea of the individual and this idea of individual aspiration. And many would say in the United States, we've taken it to an extreme where the individualism over the idea of solidarity and collectivism really prevails in terms of our policy. And Arthur, you are certainly known in the United States as someone Republican candidates go to for advice. Tell us, how is it that the intersection of markets and policy becomes so fraught? Because in order to achieve many of the objectives of inclusive capitalism, addressing policy, for example, the very controversial idea of redistribution policy in the United States, for example, has to be addressed in order for inclusive capitalism to be achieved. Am I right?
You are right. The biggest problem that we have is misunderstanding what capitalism is supposed to be. Capitalism, or more broadly free enterprise, is a tool. It's not an end in itself. It's an instrumentality. It's important to remember what the intrinsic importance of what capitalism can provide is. And how we see that is actually by going back to the father of modern capitalist thinking, of course, Adam Smith. Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations in 1776. It's the treatise that helps us to understand still today how capitalism can create explosive wealth and lift people up, indeed. But it wasn't his first or best book. According to Adam Smith, by the way, 17 years earlier, in 1759, he published The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And The Theory of Moral Sentiments reminded people that they had to earn freedom, that it was a moral system of what we would think about today as global brotherhood. It's properly ordered ethics. It's an understanding of our importance inside a community, that we have to keep in order our faith and our family and our community and the sanctification of our ordinary work as a moral value. And if we don't do that, capitalism becomes nothing more than any other tool to be used for good or ill through sheer serendipity. The thing that we forget in modern American politics, and modern global politics for that matter, is that our morals come before our markets. This is really important. No one who's a free market economist like me should ever make the assertion that markets will take care of themselves, because they're in human hands. And it's the human soul that has to be stewarded first before we can get to the free markets that create the explosive wealth that I discussed earlier.
So in some ways, it comes back to you, because what you're saying, Arthur, is that people who are in charge of the markets have to be imbued with some sense of morality. And how do you see this, Archbishop?
I think it goes deeper than simply a sense of morality, which can become a negative thing. I mustn't do this, I mustn't do that. A market that is based in morality is one where we heard earlier that wonderful phrase that capitalism is the operating system. A capitalist system that is imbued with morality is one that sees what it is for, that turns that into action, not just policy, because policy is easy, delivery is rather hard, that turns it into action that meets the need of the poor and the excluded and the suffering. For that to happen, yes, there must be a moral conscience within the markets, but there also has to be a deep sense of the virtues, not only of creativity, which are very ample in capitalism, of the noble vocation, as the Pope called it, but also of gratuity, of a generosity of spirit that doesn't always seek the greatest return, and above all, of being alongside those who are suffering. I was very struck by your comment about that picture that changed the way you looked at the world, the picture of the boy. Most of us who have made big changes in life at some point or another, who have got this, or seek to get it, there's been some moment, some education process from what Pope Francis called smelling the sheep and smelling of the sheep, being alongside people. I learned more in my 3 years in a very poor area of the country as an assistant priest when I was first ordained than I did from any amount of study or work. It's just living alongside what my bishop called people who have things done to them rather than do things. And it was so educational. We need a capitalist system that is not separate. That's the point of the inclusivity, but inclusivity means being alongside, being as Christ was in his incarnation, being in the middle of it all, feeling it in your guts as well as in your head and your moral system.
So let's get real. You've got a group in this room of CEOs of companies, and what you're saying to them is, you've got to go back and basically preach a sermon to the troops. I mean, does Indra Nooyi have to go back to PepsiCo now and feel that she's got to give a moral talk to PepsiCo Global, the tens of thousands of people around the world, and in order, I mean, is that realistic to expect?
Yeah, of course it's not realistic, not for a second. Apart from anything, moral sermons don't make a lot of difference. Moses found that quite adequately about 3,500 years ago. You can preach morality till you're blue in the face. It doesn't make anyone better. It's partly about example, but it is above all about the vision we have for what we're there for. Are we imbued with a sense of the common good, of deeply desiring to see continuing what has happened since the 1970s, the lifting of vast numbers of people out of poverty, this sense that you find in Keynes of an ultimate objective of a world that flourishes, in which every human being has the opportunity to flourish. Now that is set by the way companies work, by the way leadership is given, not just by corporate social responsibility and philanthropy, essential and wonderful as they are, but by the whole sense of policy of what we're there for. Is it for making a good return on capital? That has to be part of it, or we self-liquidate. But it has to be much greater and something that inspires people to give their lives for a good cause.
So in some ways you are hearkening a call to action for corporate boards to hire people who are imbued with this vision.
Yes. Quite a lot of them do, but yes.
And quite a lot of them don't.
I'm not sufficiently expert to speak about that. I'm sure they could.
They, of course, have the potential. For you, Arthur, getting back to politics, because this always comes back to politics, don't we also have to have a body politic that is imbued with some sense of what is right and wrong and moral and amoral?
Yeah, absolutely. And I do believe that every single one of us in this room has a personal apostolate to a mission to talk about what's right and good. That's the joy of our jobs. Nothing else matters. To do good, to be inclusive of other people, particularly those with less power than us. This is the big opportunity. We get one chance. And this is, of course, the joy that can come from earning our own success, such that others can earn their own success as well, is my view. Now, in the body politic, the biggest problem, in my view, that we have in talking about inclusion is that we have, in politics, we tend to talk, and this gets back to Pope Francis. Pope Francis talks about the pastor smelling like the sheep, and what he's talking about is getting out among people who are not in this room. That each one of us has not an obligation, an opportunity, a wonderful, joyful opportunity to get out among those who are not like us, the joy of life. Interestingly, at a conference recently, I cited Pope Francis and said that we need to smell like the sheep, and the conference organizer was really moved by that and said, remember the admonition that we're supposed to smell like the poor. And I said, that's not what I said at all. I mean, that's the absolute misquote of Pope Francis, for sure. But here's the problem when we don't actually have any contact with people who are not like us, who are economically excluded, is we tend to start to see poor people and people who are vulnerable as the other. They're not the other, they're our brothers and sisters. This is to see poor people as liabilities to manage. The central problem of modern politics in capitalist societies and every kind of society for that matter is to see poor people as liabilities to manage as opposed to assets to develop. Not just an economic problem, the human problem is to have dead capital, dead human capital all around us, which fails to dignify people who are being left behind. There's nothing that's less dignified than being idle, than not to work, than not to earn success, than not to have a sanctified vocation. And this means that in politics, just as in business, if we can see every person as an asset to develop as opposed to a liability to manage, it's a profound shift in the way that we see things. And that's, in my view, that's the nature of inclusion, and therefore is the sine qua non of inclusive capitalism.
And so how do we get there when, in fact, in some ways, capitalism breeds hierarchical thinking and stratifies us as people? It creates classes, and often classes are identified by excluded identities. So in the United States, for example, it comes as no surprise that African Americans are often lower class, a history of exclusion. No surprise in England, the asylum seekers, people from particular parts of Asia, generation after generation remain mired in poverty. What does it take to make capitalism change that paradigm?
I think, first of all, we have to go beyond just looking at England and the United States, or Europe and the United States, the areas of greatest prosperity. This is a conference about what we do in action rather than mere policy. I think the key thing comes down to time management, comes down to how you organize your life. For me, one of the most important things I ever do is having slugs of the diary set aside to spend time in places that are uncomfortable, challenging, and difficult. Because nobody cares that, nobody thinks I'm important, nobody cares tuppence if I was. They're areas of poverty, areas where the church is struggling, and that's round the world. In some of the poorest parts of the world, the average Anglican is an African woman in her 30s on less than $3 a day. And it's being there and being alongside and taking the time to do that constantly corrects the bias we get by being in wonderful places like this, where we begin to think that this is all there is. So part of it is simply the management of what we allow ourselves to be exposed to, the risks we take. That's a personal decision. It has to be done literally through managing the diary. And
so for a CEO whose time, we might think that a CEO's time is their own, it's the public's time, and it's their corporate board's time. How are they to spend their time managing their diary to this objective?
Well, I mean, one of the most useful things that was said to me when I took this job was by a former head of government who said, your diary has to reflect your priorities, not your priorities, your diary. And he said he'd only ever met 2 or 3 people for whom that was true. And I think we have to, I mean, I'm aware of the problem of full diary, I can tell you. It's the biggest problem. It's the only resource we can't create more of is time. And we have to simply say chunks of it in order to be better at what we're doing to end our lives with a sense that we have left something worthwhile has to be among the sheep.
Mm-hmm. Well, one point I think worth making, Darren, is that capitalism does not create hierarchy and stratification. People create hierarchy and stratification. I have never seen more hierarchy and stratification and exclusion than in socialist economies, ever. Those of you who were behind the Iron Curtain before the fall of the Soviet Union, remember the state apparatus created winners and losers that were more brutal. People would permanently be at the bottom of these societies. There was no merit that was rewarded. Power, brute power was rewarded. And this is what we get to fight against, whether these are capitalist economies or socialist economies, is the human tendency to stratify and to exclude. And that's a moral problem. It's a problem of moral sentiments as opposed to the wealth of nations.
So there's one final thing I want to say about trust, because in fact, trust is at the center of productive, prosperous capitalist markets. And there's someone in this audience I know who knows a little bit about trust, Richard Edelman, who manages a very, very important trust barometer. So Richard, maybe a brief comment from you.
Yeah. So just a couple quick points. We've been doing this study for 15 years, 27 countries, and the bad news for business is that we've had a discontinuous fall in trust in business to the level of 2009. There is really no improvement for financial services, which continues to drag down the reputation of business. FX issues and other things continue to be problematic. The reputation of CEOs also went backward to the level of 2009. In the developed countries, CEO trust is at 30% or below, shocking numbers. In developing countries, all you CEOs should take a bow, you're loved. However, government continues to rank 20 points below business in most markets. So the truth is people actually see that there's nobody driving the car, and that's scary. So what are the opportunities for business? Well, people actually now believe that business can make a profit and do good for society, so performance with purpose, as Indra says. Second, they actually see that business is going to be the source of innovation. They believe that. They want to believe, but they're deeply scared on privacy, security, and environment, and the sense of always having to be on. And so those are the issues. Darren, over back to you.
Thanks very much, Richard. So we're going to wind down. A big thanks to Arthur Brooks and to the Archbishop Justin for a great conversation. Next up.